Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our online combined Sunday school classes, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class, two of our larger Sunday school classes here at First Presbyterian Church on North Elm Street at Fisher Park, near downtown Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I lead the hymn singing for the Young Men's Bible class, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us as we gather together here, as I said, online for worship and study on this, the 21st Sunday after Pentecost, Sunday, October 17th. Our Sunday school teacher, Sandie Gravett, is continuing her series of talks on the book of 2 Corinthians, Apostle Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. The Young Men's Bible class is gathering in person at Redhead Hall, and we'll watch the video there. And the Agape class is meeting in person in the garden room here at First Presbyterian Church, where they will watch the video. But we'll continue to offer it here for you online in the event that you're unable or unwilling to attend in person. Sandie's teaching presentation will follow here in just a moment. This afternoon at 3 o'clock, we'll hold a service of installation for our senior pastor, the Reverend Jill Duffield. She will officially become our 12th senior pastor here at First Presbyterian Church so far in our 197-year history. Again, that service of installation will be at 3 o'clock in our sanctuary, followed by a lemonade reception outside. If you can't attend in person, you can watch the live stream. Just go to our website, www.fpcgreensboro.org. That's www.fpcgreensboro.org, where you can find the link. And now, let's sing a hymn together. Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. This is another wonderful text written by Charles Wesley. Wesley was a prolific poet. He wrote some 9,000 poems of a spiritual nature. 6,000 of those are actually hymns. I read once that Wesley wrote many of his hymns while he was riding on horseback from one evangelical meeting to another. I also learned recently that the opening line of this hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, is actually a play on the opening line of a poem by John Dryden called Fairest Isle, All Isles Excelling. It was later made into an opera with music by Henry Purcell. The verses of this hymn are absolutely rich, and they're filled with scriptural and biblical quotes. In the last stanza, changed from glory into glory, it's almost a direct quotation, ironically, from the book of 2 Corinthians, the source of Sandie's Sunday school teaching. In the hymn text, Wesley also describes a day in heaven where we will take our place till we cast our crowns before Thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise. Again, scriptural quotations and such beautiful poetry. As always, I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me. Love divine, all loves excelling.
Love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. Fix in us thy humble dwelling, all thy faithful mercies crown. Jesus, thou art all compassion, pure unbounded love thou art. Visit us with thy salvation, enter every trembling heart. Breathe, oh breathe thy loving Spirit into every troubled breast. Let us all in Thee inherit, let us find the promised rest. Take away the love of sinning, Alpha and Omega be, end of faith has its beginning, set our hearts at liberty. Come come, Almighty, to deliver. Let us all thy life receive. Suddenly return and never, never more thy temples leave. Thee we would be always blessing, serve thee as thy hosts above, pray and praise thee without ceasing, glory in thy perfect love. Finish then thy new creation, pure and spotless let us be. Let us see thy great salvation, perfectly restored in thee, changed from glory into glory, till in heaven we take our place, till we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise.
I am a big fan of autumn. I love the crisp, cool air and bright blue sky. I can tell you about many of the trees in my neighborhood, as well as on the way to and in Boone, pointing out the ones that are typically showy in this season. Then, of course, there is the smell, a nice wood fire on a cool evening. After a summer of heat and humidity, autumn is a welcome relief. But I also feel, as many of us do, a tad melancholy. It is, after all, a season of impending death. The light goes away more and more until we hit winter and darkness at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. All the lovely leaves eventually pile up on the ground, dead, leaving bare limbs behind. You even see fewer and fewer people, either because they're all bundled up and moving on more quickly, or because indoor activities start to take hold. We tend, however, not to despair about such changes, because just as surely as fall and winter come, so too will spring and summer reemerge in just a few short months. When it comes to nature, we understand this cyclical pattern of life and death. Moreover, we know how to see life made visible even in decay. It is, of course, far more challenging to do so when it comes to human existence, and most especially when it comes to our own lives. In 2 Corinthians 4, where we are today, Paul is focused on our bodies with all of their mortal woes. He is clear-eyed about the inevitability of the end to our mortal flesh. And yet, he is also not despairing. Instead, Paul revels in the challenges of such an existence, and that reveling is, for many of us, a stark moment, helping us to begin the process of rethinking the way we live and the choices we are apt to make. Let's dive in. Paul again in this chapter begins talking about the ministry and the message he has been about in the city of Corinth with his team. He is coming off a section where we have been focused, justifying his ministry in the community and making the point that what they are doing is not all about them and what they can achieve. It is, rather, revelatory of God. Thus, he starts in verses 7 to 12 to introduce yet another passage that packs quite a punch. Take a listen to the New Revised Standard Version. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. I want you to pay attention, first of all, to how Paul describes the conditions for him and for his workers. In verses 8 and 9, check out these 4 verbs. All of them are in the present tense, indicating that the things he is describing are ongoing. Afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, struck down. It does not sound all that pleasant, does it? But I am also aware of how he describes their reaction to each circumstance. In the first instance, they are, without doubt, feeling the pressure of their effort and what they are called to do as servants to a community like this one and others. It can, he says, and does feel as if one is being squeezed, confined, constricted. I don't think here he means physically confined, although he certainly did spend time in prison. Instead, he seems to be talking about other ways we can feel pressured, especially by how others see us, define us, understand us, and respond to us. We can all appreciate the pressure of being cast into a particular role. Perhaps you do not fit the stereotype of what it is to be a parent or a good worker or the member of some group. It brings to mind a friend who recently had her first child and literally had to say to Facebook for people to back off on the judgment about all of her decisions as a parent, from the one she made to get vaccinated against COVID while she was pregnant, to the ones on how to have her child and dog interact, to the ways in which she chooses to put her child to sleep or treat her child's skin rash. She needed the space to find her own way as a mother in consultation with her family and her team without feeling the censure and pressure of others. Paul and his group were feeling that kind of pressure with regard to expectations, some of which we have seen in the painful interactions he has described with this community. But he says these things do not restrain or hem them in. That's the Greek verb here. That is, he expresses that they are not limited or blocked by the way other people try to restrict who they are and what they are about. They have learned to be true to themselves even when others are trying to push them to embody something different. Now, the next phrase for me is probably the one I can appreciate most in these days. They are, Paul says, dumbfounded. That would be the word here translated as perplexed by what is going on. Because people will often do things that just baffle you, and baffle you especially when they act in ways that are contrary to their own interests. Paul doesn't understand in this passage at all how people who have heard the gospel can fall for what all those others we've been talking about in the weeks before are peddling. He doesn't get how perfectly intelligent people can be fooled by charlatans and self-aggrandizers, and how they can go down some mighty strange roads. But Paul says this situation does not leave them, I love this word, completely disoriented, meaning without a way. Despairing is the translation that is most common here. We can all appreciate his point because we live in times where the most extreme voices on either end of the spectrum tend to be the ones that get amplified the most and shape opinions in ways that can and do have devastating consequences. when reason and logic are not having an impact, when honesty and integrity are not winning the day, it can become all too easy to feel at a loss for what to do next. Paul, however, doesn't go there. Instead, he every day is continuing to try to talk to people about making good decisions, trusting that this is what he is supposed to be about. Still, sometimes there are heightened levels of threat. Thus, his next phrase is about when they're feeling hunted down, when people seem to be out to get them, pursuing them, acting in a way that makes them want to flee. It's easy to understand how in this situation you might choose to throw in the towel. But Paul says in such a setting, there is another option. He says they are not left without, abandoned, or without resources. I appreciate the image he conjures here. It is sometimes difficult in our worst of moments to recognize what we have to draw on to get through. A friend of mine at work was facing a difficult situation where she was in the public eye, and the circumstances were ratcheting up every day in ways that were spinning her life out of control and making her feel endangered, even in her own home. But she said that it was then that resources she was not anticipating became accessible to her. People she did not know she could count on, for instance, helped her see a way through when she was becoming convinced every exit door was being blocked. That brings me to the last of Paul's phrases. When they are cast or even struck down, that is, knocked about in a way that would make most people feel as if the only option was to stay down for the count, Paul says they are not destroyed. And this verb is harsh. It means destroyed as in perishing or killed. There is simply no quit in Paul or in his team, even in the most dire of situations. This vision, this optimism might be surprising to some of you because Paul is not the most glass half full person you're going to encounter. But his rationale, the reason that he feels this way, becomes clear in the next few phrases. He says, always the death of Jesus in the body carrying, in order that also the life of Jesus in the body should be manifested. For unceasingly we the living to death are being handed over on account of Jesus, in order that also the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. And that's a mouthful, and it can make your head hurt if you don't take the time to pull it apart. What does Paul mean here? I want you to first notice that his reference is not the Christ or Jesus Christ or the Lord Jesus Christ or the Lord. I'm making that point because that phraseology is typical of how Paul talks about the person of Christ. Instead, here he is using Jesus, and that choice is certainly intentional. We need to remember that Paul never met Jesus when Jesus walked the earth. Paul's claim to his apostolic status rests on his encounter with the risen Christ, the risen Lord. And when it comes down to it, his gospel message is largely that. He talks, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 2, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Or we might look at Romans 5, For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. But God proves God's love for us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. For Paul, the human life of Jesus is completely subsumed by this salvific story. Jesus is God's Christ, the risen Lord, carrying out God's work. But in this passage, Paul is clearly talking about the human life of Jesus. There are at least two things going on here. The first is the common line in the commentaries on this text. Paul wants to say that Jesus' way of being human led to his death. Jesus was an exemplar, a role model for Paul and for those who were associated with him. No matter what kind of opposition Paul and his crew experienced, no matter if they landed in prison, no matter the threats to their efforts, even if everything were to result in his death, Paul saw it as following in the steps of Jesus, whose life took a course that meant he was constantly enduring opposition, and that opposition eventually led to the end of his human life on the cross. Paul is not that concerned about whether he and his group will endure a similar fate. Remember, for him, the cross is not a loss. It was a gain to all humanity. It was also an opportunity for God to reveal the way to eternal life. Thus, for Paul, the death of Jesus was an inevitable outcome, not simply because he was human, but because the way that Jesus lived challenged the premises of being in this world. To circle back to my starting point, Jesus' life increasingly showed signs that his death was coming, and it was not going to be a natural death, but rather was going to emerge sooner and at the hands of people that would hurt him. In this way, Jesus was carrying his death in his body, much like autumn carries in it the death that will come in winter. Still, as with nature, if you know how to see it, you don't see death, but you see the continuing cycle of life. And that leads to the second reason Paul is focused on Jesus in this passage. This particular way of thinking is less well recognized, but I would say also significant. Paul is sniffing around the idea of incarnation and what it means. To help us understand how, I look to the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, "In the incarnation, the whole human race recovers the dignity of the image of God." For Paul here, the way that we are called to live is not simply about our needs, our wants, our calling, our mission. It is also a statement about who we are in relationship to God and what our lives as individuals and the church should be about to continue the creative work of God. He says, "For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you." This statement is not simply one about embracing death, mortality, as inevitable. It is not even about being a people, a body that sides with the constricted, pressed together, confined, the perplexed, the ones at a loss, the people who are aggressively chased or pursued, the ones made to flee, or with the cast or struck down. Rather, it is about realizing that when we live our lives as Paul is describing, that will be naturally the way that we find our life unfolding. And that's the case because we are existing right at the place where Jesus brought life, right where God was made visible. That brings us to this idea. It is imperfect and weak and mortal flesh that is vulnerable, that we have to be willing to embrace fully because that's where God went. It takes me back to the image of our bodies as clay jars. What an apt metaphor for his audience then and now. Any archaeologist would certainly appreciate it. One of the most common finds at any archaeological site in this region is pottery, and clay jars were ubiquitous because they were essential to the way that people lived. Once folks settled down, became more sedentary, these jars were how they stored their foodstuffs, their water, not to mention their medicines and their ointments. In short, these clay jars were how you managed to keep on hand the things you needed to keep you alive. When we ponder this image, we need to realize that the clay jars were durable through all kinds of conditions, much like our bodies. And they were like our bodies in another way. They could be cast and maintained in both day-to-day use forms of all sizes and shapes, as well as in more artistic pieces. And yet Paul chooses to use this image for another reason, because he knows, like we do, that any pottery, no matter what its size or form or decorative valuation, does not last forever. It cracks, it chips, it shatters, and it can fall into all kinds of disrepair before it is no longer serviceable. Indeed, to go back to my archaeologists, when we find it, we most often find shards. The metaphor starts taking on a new cast. Is it beginning to sound familiar to some of us who know our bodies behave in the same way? Paul is here elevating these mortal bodies because he recognizes that God chose to take one on. Paul elevates these mortal bodies because he sees that they are storehouses for treasures of all kinds, even a storehouse for God, God's self. To reiterate, Paul is strikingly unconcerned about mortality and threats of death. He is not bothered by the fragility of the human body, either naturally or through some dire set of circumstances. And the reason why is simple. He sees what is unfolding in his life not on a temporary limited scale of suffering, like a human who finds himself in physical peril or even sees his physical form declining. And he encourages us to see ourselves in the same way. He writes, "So we do not lose heart, even though our outer nature is wasting away. Our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal." I will admit that Paul is tough for most of us here because he is not worried in the least about this flesh. He recognizes our temporary status while we live in a culture that is obsessed with our bodies. We live in a time and in a place where we seek constantly to care for this earthen vessel, to keep it young, to repair its cracks and chips, and keep it functional, to resist death. But Paul is asking us to do something else. He is asking us to carry death with us as Jesus carried his death with him, knowing that death is not an end, but believing that Jesus demonstrated to us that death is another step in the eternity of God, the precondition for bringing into being something new. In this season, coming as it does in a difficult year filled with so much death, when we are still uncertain about what the future holds, it is a timely lesson. Our death-denying culture has been brought face to face with a reality that many still want to resist. Therefore, I encourage us to ask ourselves, how are we living in ways that acknowledge death, that grieve it, and yet also understand death as an opportunity to demonstrate the power and the presence of God? I will leave you with that question. Thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to continuing this series with you next week.